There was a lot of research that was done both during and after COVID on connection and isolation. They put people in these fMRI machines, which are functional MRI machines, to better understand how our brains function. And what that showed scientists is that our brain's default is social. We are wired for connection.
You are the most common denominator in every experience and interaction you have ever had and you ever will have. So it's not just even relationships. You literally bring yourself into everything you see, everything you process, everything you observe, everything you experience.
Welcome to our very first episode of Reconnect.
Ancient insights for thriving relationships.
Where ancient Jewish wisdom meets modern relationship dynamics. Join us as we explore a holistic approach to navigating life's most important connections. I'm Menachem Lehrfield.
And I'm Sarah Lehrfield.
And this is Reconnect. When we were trying to come up with a topic for our podcast, I think for both of us, the idea of relationships came to the surface. That was, I think, our most obvious choice, because at the end of the day, life is all about relationships.
Yeah, you can't live with them and you can't live without them.
And it's interesting, you really can't live without them. There was a lot of research that was done both during and after COVID on not just relationships, but on connection and isolation. And there was one that was particularly fascinating to me, where they put people in these fMRI machines, which are functional MRI machines, to better understand how our brains function. So basically, an fMRI is where you're in an MRI machine, but you're fully awake and you're in a place where you can actually monitor and function, where they can actually monitor the different brain functions as you're going about normal activities. There was one study which I found really fascinating, where they monitored people as they were engaging with different activities. Some were social and some were non-social. So by non-social, I don't mean like antisocial. It just means like not sociable. So sociable is where we're doing things together, and non-social is when I'm doing something by myself in isolation. What they found is that we actually use different parts of our brain when we're performing social or non-social activities. The fascinating thing is that as soon as we finish a non-social activity, our brain automatically defaulted right back to social. And what that showed scientists is that the default is social. Our brain's default is social. That's where it goes. So even if we switch to a non-social activity, as soon as we're done with that, it almost like resets back to social, preparing us to then do a social activity.
We're wired for connection.
We are. It's really, really fascinating. We are wired for connection. They did another study where they mimicked rejection. And what they found is that the part of our brain that fires when we are feeling emotional pain, when we're feeling slighted, when we're feeling rejection, when we're feeling isolated, is the same part of our brain that fires when we feel physical pain. Isn't that cool? Mm-hmm. So like when somebody says, we use the expression like feeling pain when we talk about emotional pain, it's actually true. We feel emotional pain very much the same way that we feel physical pain. There isn't really much distinction between the two. When we say like, ouch, that hurt, it did. When we're expressing something that's really going on in our brain, we're feeling pain really in the same way. At the end of the day, as human beings, we have these basic needs, and we think of our basic needs as food, clothing, shelter, but it's also belonging and acceptance and all of the emotional needs that we have. Bottom line, humans crave relationships, and we crave relationships in the same way that we crave our basic needs.
Yeah. And so we are in a relationship. We have children. We've grown up in families. We have friends. We're part of a community. We connect with people on a consistent basis. It's actually the core of everything that we do. And
both personally and professionally.
Yeah. And I think we're fascinated by relationships. We've watched ourselves evolve in our relationship, and we've watched ourselves evolve in our relationship with our children and in our relationship with our parents and with our friends and people in our community. I don't think we even realize how much we engage on a relational level throughout the day. And sometimes it's almost like so much that we need that alone time. But sometimes we need to take that break and that space to reconnect internally, because there's also that essential relationship with self. But it says in Parshat Bereshit, Lo tov hayot adam levado, that God said it is not good for the human being to be alone, that it is essential to have connection. And I think it's such a powerful statement, that first relationship of Adam and Eve, that was like the kind of the paradigm for all relationships, how essential it is for all of us to find those connections. And not one relationship is going to service all of our needs. It's important to have different thriving relationships in our life and to create those kinds of connections. And as we evolve, create different kinds of connections. But the point is that it's clear from the Torah, just as much as science, that relationships are central to not just our physical needs and emotional needs, but also to just our evolution as human beings.
Yeah. And the truth is, if you look at Judaism, it is really all about relationships. The Maharal of Prague, who's considered kind of like the father of Jewish mysticism, really the source of a lot of our Jewish mysticism, talks about the fact that in Judaism, we have these things called mitzvot, which are often, I think, personally mistranslated as commandments. The Hebrew word for a commandment is a tzivoy, not a mitzvah. Mitzvah means something different. And the Maharal explains that a mitzvah is really an opportunity for connection. It's an opportunity for relationship. And he explains that we have these three primary relationships. We have a relationship with self, which you mentioned, a few minutes ago. And I think that's actually something that's hard to understand. We'll get to that in just a second. But then there's also a relationship with others, which is probably the easiest for us to understand. And then we have a relationship with a higher power. And he explains that every mitzvah we have, every quote unquote commandment, I'm doing air quotes as if people can see me on the thing that has no video associated with it. Every mitzvah, every commandment is an opportunity to really build all those relationships. But there's one of those relationships that it's predominantly building. So when we talk about these 613 mitzvot, the positive ones are ways that we build those relationships. And the prohibitions, what we call the averot, these prohibitions are essentially Jewish wisdom saying, you already have a natural relationship here. You've already built this relationship. Don't blow it up. So either it's a natural relationship that's already there. You have a relationship between, let's say, your parents and their children, or it's a relationship that you've already spent time building. And an Avera says the action you're about to do
Is going to hurt somebody.
is going to erode, not just going to hurt somebody, it's going to erode the relationship. It's really going to hurt both of you. It's going to erode a relationship that is already present. And therefore, don't do this action because it's going to erode the relationship between you and yourself.
But if you do, you're human, and that's why we have repair.
Yes, there's always repair. We can have another episode on the power of repair.
Yeah.
But beware of the fact that this action has the potential to erode a relationship between you and yourself, you and others, and you and a higher power. And just be aware and cognizant of that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about the relationship. It's interesting, one of those three primary relationships is that relationship with self.
Well, and you also just said, which I think is interesting too, that when you hurt other people, you're also hurting yourself. Or when you disconnect with a larger community or larger spiritual energy in the world, you're also hurting yourself. So it's like all comes back to self.
Yeah. But I think even that relationship with self is hard for us to understand. You look at the dictionary definition. The dictionary definition of relationships is the way in which two or more concepts, objects, or people are connected. So we generally think of relationships as between me and someone else. But the truth is, definitely the Maharal is saying that's not true. You can have a relationship with self, which I think when he refers to that relationship with self, he refers to a relationship with soul, is that we are bodies and souls combined together. Often we think of ourselves as, a body that has a soul. People, I ask often, and do you have a soul? People will say, yeah, I have a soul. It's been famously said, no, you are not a body that has a soul. You are a soul that has a body. And the more we identify with our soul, the more we're both developing and reflecting on that relationship with self. But ultimately, it starts with self. It always starts with self.
Yeah, and I think that it's not the relationship that we necessarily pursue or focus on with intention. But I find that when we're in relationships with other people, or we're in relationships with God, there is so much that we learn about ourselves. So like we said, all of these mitzvot bring us back to ourselves. All of our relationships, they bring us back to ourselves. And so really what the core of all of our relationships is our relationship with ourselves.
That's very interesting. It's fascinating. You're saying really goes both directions. It's that when I'm in relationship with others and relationship with God, I'm learning about myself, but also when I am in a relationship with self and I'm focused on that self, I learn so much more about my relationships with others.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. So true. Yeah. Because the relationship with yourself affects all the other relationships you have. And that's really what we've, I think, discovered over the last many years of all of our significant relationships is that there's so much that happens internally and on a soul level that we're unaware of. And it's hard. It's hard to access our souls because our bodies are so loud. And so it takes a lot of intentional turning inward or gazing inward to explore your internal world, to understand yourself, to understand the parts of you, and ultimately the intricacies and uniqueness and magnificence of your soul. And when you do that, when you go on that journey, it seems to have these ripple effects in all the other relationships that you have. And so while we may think that all these other relationships are more tangible, it's actually the relationship with self and with soul that's the most effective or the most powerful in a way that not just affects who you become and who you grow into becoming, but also into all these other relationships that you have. And in my exploration of being a parent for the last 14 years and trying to better understand my children, I learned that while it's important to learn about your kids, it is far more important to learn about myself and to own my narrative and to work through different ways that I see myself or the neural pathways that I've created in my brain and the way that I connect with others and I see the world. And doing that has far more of a powerful effect in my relationship with my children than learning how to do things for my children or how my children are being, but rather who am I being in this relationship, learning so much about myself, but then working on that and focusing on that as opposed to, and they say that parenting, it's not between you and your child, it's really within yourself. That's really where true parenting happens because Lord knows our children can trigger us in all different kinds of ways. So that's really, those triggers are very informational.
As you're saying all that, what comes to mind is the famous story from the Chavetz Chaim of Yisrael Meir Kagan. And he talks about how, he set out on this mission to change the world. We all want to change the world. And he saw that wasn't really working. So then he started to try and influence the people in his city, and that didn't work. And then he tried to influence the people in his town, and that didn't work. And as a rabbi, he tried to influence his congregants and the people who would come to him for advice, and that didn't work. So he figured, okay, at least I can work on changing my family. And when that didn't work, he had nowhere else to go and nowhere else to turn but to turn inward. Mm-hmm. And then the more he focused on himself, the more that influenced his family and the more that changed his community and eventually did change the world.
Yeah.
We don't have any direct connection to him, but yet we're still studying his works. We're still living by
his wisdom
set.
Yeah. And I think we as human beings don't necessarily know all the time the ripple effects of our internal work, but that energy exists in the world and it's there, it's impactful, and it's doing something. And that's the kind of energy we want to put out for sure. I think it's just so interesting because those concentric circles are very, if you actually imagine them, like that ripple effect, it's a very powerful imagery because really you're taking your soul and it's extending outward. So the more that you know your soul, the more you know yourself in other relationships, which will develop stronger, healthier relationships. And then the more that you'll know yourself in your larger connection with a higher power. And that expands your soul, that expands you. And really, when I think of my soul, I think of it as something that's so internal and that it's a process of turning inward to really explore and understand, but for a specific purpose of, yes, knowing your soul and knowing yourself is very powerful, but it's impactful when that soul extends out of you to other people, right? When you speak, it's an expression of your soul. You're taking what's in you and you're putting it out of you. And so it's the more that you know internally, the more that what comes out of you and what comes out of your soul into these other relationships, into these ripple effects, it's literally an expansion of who you are in like a concrete existence in a way that's like tangible and effective from something that's so intangible. Like the soul feels so intangible, but it's actually a very concrete part of every single thing you do every single day.
Because it's you.
Yeah.
And you can literally see that expand. Shimon Shkup explained that the primary motivation of every person is what he calls the ani, right? The I. And we can look at that as like this very selfish, negative thing and almost like push back and say, wait a second, that's bad. We should change that. But when we understand what he's saying, what Jewish wisdom is teaching us is that it is the reality of who we are. Human beings are wired where our primary motivation is ourselves. And we can fight that and argue that and say, well, that's selfish, bad.
Connection.
We are wired for connection. That's exactly his point, is that it's not a contradiction. It's beautiful, yeah. But what he explains is that our goal is not to fight the selfish tendencies we have inside. Our goal is to begin including others in that concept of self.
So they're one and the same.
They're one and the same. So, he explains, again, this isn't the way it always has to work, but in at least his paradigm, the way he explains it is I start off as the single individual and we start up as babies and we're very selfish. And as we go through life and we start having these relationships, the people we have relationships with start to literally become an extension of self. So that in a way, all these other people in my life, my friends,
are part of you.
My spouse, my children, my parents are all an extension of myself. And
but not a reflection of you.
Not a reflection of me, but an extension.
Yeah.
And the same selfish drives I have to protect and preserve and take care of myself are now being channeled into all the people around me.
Yeah. And I feel that could expand to people we don't know, like in connections that we have or people that are not like we could see the whole world that way. There's so much more respect and so much more compassion and so much more love between even strangers because we just see the world as like just a part of who we are. But ultimately, it boils down to you. In other words, the only thing you can control at the end of the day is yourself. The only thing that you can have the ability to change and evolve is you. You put up boundaries for yourself. You learn more about yourself so you can express yourself in relationships. You learn about how to be calmer in certain situations or navigate fears and anxieties and insecurities. That's you. That's your responsibility. You cannot be responsible for anybody else's evolution but your own.
As we try.
Yes, as much as we try. And the truth is that soul and that self is what comes into every relationship that you have. Harville Hendricks says, instead of looking for the right relationship, become the right partner or become the right person in the relationship. In other words, you see the world the way you are. You see the relationships the way that you see them from your perspectives, from your biases, from your emotions, from your neural pathways, from your parts, from your anxieties and fears and all the things inside of you. And the more that you work on yourself and the more that you get to know yourself, the more that will extend outward. As I learned this idea and really begun this process and this journey of integrating it into my life, it's actually really eye-opening how much I've discovered about myself and what's going on in my internal world in interactions that I have and the ways I feel after those interactions or the way I feel even before an interaction or how I feel when I see somebody or how I respond or react more to a situation that happens. When you bring it back to self, it's not that you're blaming on yourself or shaming yourself. It's becoming aware of what's going on inside of you so that it kind of can help you understand the perspective you're having or the energy you're putting out or your responses or reactions that you're having. And that feels to me a lot more empowering than just always trying to figure out what I need to do for somebody else in order to feel fulfilled in a relationship.
Right. Like we have access to ourselves. We can change ourselves.
Yeah.
We can change our mindsets.
Yeah.
We can change the way.
Yeah. And so the same way that we have all these relationships, we have holidays and moments of prayer and mitzvot to connect to God. And we have in our relationships, we date or we spend time with our kids or we connect with our spouse. Like we have to date ourselves. Like we have to get to know ourselves. Like we tend to those other relationships, but how often do we? And sometimes people meditate. Therapy is helpful or some self-exploration or a self-introspection, self-improvement. It's such a powerful way to like date yourself, get to know yourself. We should be constantly re-knowing our spouse, re-knowing our children as we evolve, as they evolve, as the relationships evolve, re-knowing the different people in our life. And we have to also re-know our soul as it in all of its facets. And as you continue to evolve as a person, I heard this quote: "You are the most common denominator in every experience and interaction you have ever had and you ever will have." So it's not just even relationships. You literally bring yourself into everything you see, everything you process, everything you observe, everything you experience. You are the common denominator in everything that's happening to you and around you, which means all that you control or all that you have power over is
So empowering.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
I think so.
I think so. I agree.
But that's also very fascinating. You're saying, and I like that. You said, if I'm quoting this correctly again, you see the world the way you are as opposed to the way it is.
Yeah.
Right. Our reality is colored by our own perspective and our own selves.
Yeah. And everything you do and everything you say and every choice that you make extracts a little bit of your soul or of your inner world external from you and is shared with others. And that's what creates connection. But it's almost like when you think of connection, it's like sharing of your soul.
Yeah.
Whether it's through words, through actions, through choices, through togetherness, or just connecting emotionally or physically, or that's really what you're doing is you just continuously extracting little bits of your soul into the world.
Such a beautiful way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the truth is it works the other way around also, right? When things happen and we react in a certain way, more often than not, our reaction is not because of the last thing that happened. And it's very easy in a superficial way to just look at the eruption and look at the thing or the activity or action that happened right before the eruption and assume this cause and effect. If I come home from a long day of work and I had a really productive day and I'm feeling great about myself and feeling great about everything around me, and I come home and I see that there's a chair that's a little askew, right? The chair at the dining room table isn't exactly where it's supposed to be. Naturally, I walk over to the chair and I straighten it. But if I'm having a bad day and it's where it's supposed to be, I kick it because I have this deep-seated desire to make my internal world and my external world aligned. When I don't see that order, when I see internal disorder being met with external disorder or the opposite, I need to align those things. And you're like, why are you doing that? Why are you taking that inanimate object? I think part of it is that internally, there's so much turmoil and disorder. And when I say dysregulation, well, the whole thing is dysregulation. But I think the dysregulation is the fact that there's so much disorder inside and flooding. You don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
But I think the nuance here is that the order on the outside is almost taunting and in conflict with the disorder that's inside.
Mm-hmm.
And we see exactly the opposite when things are internally in a good place.
I mean, the idea is that if there's chaos around you, families fighting, kids are fighting, it's a very stressful moment. You're trying to get somewhere. Again, you can't control the chaos per se, but you can control, it starts with the internal, right? You can control what's going on internally.
Yeah, but that's the point is if you're in a good space internally and there's
you can manage
kinds of chaos and all kinds of noise, so it's not that you can manage it. It doesn't even bother you. The kids are playing and having fun, they're laughing. But if you're in a bad mood, if things are internally not in a good place, and
you see things the way you are.
That's exactly. Yeah. I got angry because you did X, Y, and Z. But often those are just triggers. Mm-hmm. Often I'm being activated by something that you may have said or done. But the reality is
there's something going on inside me that has nothing to do with you. Or maybe a little bit to do with you in the sense that you triggered it.
Again, but my trigger could have had nothing. Sometimes, yes.
Instead of you triggered me, it's I was triggered by something you said or did, or something was coming up for me in what you said or did.
Yes. Even changing our language, even changing the way we say that, like you said, just saying I was triggered by it puts me in the driver's seat. It empowers me to then make a change and make a difference. But there's so many times where this has nothing to do with the other person. But that's exactly the point is when you're in a good space, the exact same thing could be happening outside. You could take that scene and replay it. And the only thing that's different is your mindset and how you're feeling and your attitude. And, the kids are playing and they're fooling around and they're making lots of noise. But if you're in a good place, it's joy to your ears. Children's laughter. What's more beautiful than children's laughter?
Tone it down.
Okay. Sometimes it can be a little annoying.
It's just like, fine, they're okay.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. But that same exact scene replaying when you're in a bad mood and things, you're just like, enough. Like, why? I can't deal with it.
Right. So what I'm saying is that the work that you can do is you can control that internal space where you can create, that regulation internally that will then affect, you can shift your perspective and how you see things, right? Because you see things the way you are, so that even if it's chaos, you can still filter it through yourself, which is calm and curious and confident.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the beauty is then that actually can affect the people around you in remarkable ways. So basically, the more you date yourself, the more you get to know yourself, and the more that will then in turn positively affect all the other relationships in your life. Again, initially, when you think of relationships, you think of between you and yourself. When you think of dating, you think of dating someone else.
Yeah.
But I think that makes a lot of sense, is that we date other people to discover and try to understand who those other people are.
Exactly.
And ideally, we continue dating our partners and our spouses because they are evolving.
Yeah.
And because they're evolving and we're evolving, we want to continuously understand who is this other person.
Right.
So we have to do the same thing with ourselves.
Yeah.
Understand who we are.
Social worker and Rabbi Yaakov Danishevsky, who wrote a phenomenal book. I don't remember what it's called. But he says...
We were in a Pesach program with him, right?
Yeah.
Is that the name?
He says, sometimes what we discover in ourselves and others is radical and new, but oftentimes, with consistency and curiosity, we appreciate a subtlety or detail that was previously unseen. So the same way that sometimes when you're with somebody, you learn something entirely new about them, or they surprise you, or things happen, challenges that you go through, and then you're like on the other side and there's like a whole new way of connection. But that also happens with yourself. Sometimes it's a big change and a big life change, a shift in your life, like your kids grow up, like stages, different stages, circumstances, milestones that you go through or your family goes through. And there's a lot of like big change there and how that affects you. But there's also nuances in relationships that keep changing and that keep developing. And so the same way that you want to keep dating your spouse, right? That's John Gottman's platform. Like, you keep dating your spouse to keep knowing them. And there are a lot of subtleties and nuances internally that we can be aware of, self-aware of, and continue to self-discover. There's no stagnation, not in our external relationships or our internal relationships. Sometimes it's a big thing, but oftentimes it's just small little things that we're learning about ourselves or understanding about ourselves.
So I think if we want to give one takeaway to our listeners.
I'm not great at the practical. Yeah.
Well, bottom line, we've talked about how important relationships are.
Yeah.
And how relationships are really the core of everything we are and everything that we do. And if all of those relationships begin and end with that relationship with self, so I think a practical takeaway would be what the Kabbalists used to call hisbodedut, which is really just take some time to be with yourself. So if I can give some homework, I always hated homework and I'm philosophically opposed to it, but if I can give some homework, it would be in the next week, spend 15 minutes alone with yourself. Spend 15 minutes dating yourself. And if you've never done this, it is a extremely uncomfortable thing to do and it feels very awkward and strange. But ultimately, it will let you and allow you to understand yourself better, know yourself better, which will in turn have this amazing ripple effect that will trickle down into every relationship that you have.
Another thing that I would suggest to think about, if this is something that you want to try and access in your life and relationships, is at any given time when you're in an interaction, consciously pause if you're feeling yourself like flooding with emotions or elevated or activated, and just take a minute or two to like, in that pause is very powerful, to like turn inward, right? Or gaze inward and just see like, what's going on in here? Like, what is going on inside of me? What's really bothering me, or what
Oh, I love that.
parts are really speaking to me. And then that may help you shift how you then interact, how you continue that interaction. Or
You're saying use your emotional cues as information
Yeah.
to help guide.
yeah. So you could do it in the moment, or you have an experience or interaction and you walk away and then you're like feeling a certain feeling. Maybe you're feeling bad about something. Maybe you're feeling angry about something. Like, instead of just carrying those feelings until, yes, time does release that energy, but instead of just like waiting for that to happen and really like actually releasing it from your body, and where we store a lot of that stuff, you actually take a few minutes to like really think about, why did that bother me? Like, I wonder what it was that this person said, or this experience that I went through that's like really triggering me or activating parts inside of me. And just like that helps you begin to understand yourself a little bit more, which again will then affect the other relationships that you have.
Love that. Okay, well, if this is something you would like for us to continue doing, please leave those reviews, let us know, and feel free to share any comments, questions, rebuttals with us. You can find our information in the show notes, and hope to see you back here. Don't forget to subscribe and share with friends.
Bye.
Bye.
As a new podcast, reviews are really important in making sure that others can find the podcast as well. So please take a moment to leave a 5-star review. Let us know what you loved, and we hope to see you back here every single month on the third Wednesday. If you are looking for all of our podcasts in one place, then you can subscribe to JOI to the World, Joy to the World, wherever you get your podcasts, and that will have weekly podcasts dropping every single week, including our new podcast, Yada Yada Yiddish, which explores Jewish lessons from the show Seinfeld, Kids Say the Deepest Things, which explores deep things that kids say, Reconnect, which explores relationships, and 0%, which explores the outsized impact of the Jewish people, and Dear Rabbi, where I answer your questions about Judaism. Again, that podcast is called JOI to the World. Do not search just JOI, or you will get all kinds of things that are very, very different. Consider yourself warned.